Thanks to its edgy reputation and openness to pixelated gore, it's no surprise that the Genesis became the home for some wild and wonderful horror games, which we'll be unearthing in this comprehensive overview of the spookier side of Sega's 16-bit catacombs, including a few haunted jaunts through neighboring subgenres and weird horror hybrids as well. So let's wise from our graves and go beast mode on horror games for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive.
Rise from your grave.
For many early adopters of the console, Altered Beast was their first experience on the system, with this being the original pack-in game with consoles sold in the late 80s and early 90s.
Power up.
The game was originally released in arcades in 1988 and developed with inspiration from the movie The Howling and Ray Harryhausen creatures, and resulted in this visually striking auto-scrolling beat-em-up, notable for its large and detailed sprites, now iconic voice samples, and memorable beast transformations. You'll punch and kick your way through 5 different Greek mythology-themed stages, smashing enemies into fleshy chunks, and collecting required power-up orbs to eventually change into a different beast form per level, including a werewolf, dragon, bear, and tiger, each with different abilities and attacks. Other than a few subtle graphical and gameplay tweaks, the Genesis port is quite faithful to the arcade version, and helps set a new standard for bringing an authentic arcade experience to a home system. It also had a slew of sometimes questionable ports for other consoles and computer platforms like the Master System, Famicom, TurboGrafx, Commodore 64, and many others, not to mention appearing on many Sega compilations and collections. Several years later, Altered Beast also finally received a couple of lesser-known sequels on the Game Boy Advance and PlayStation 2. Today, the original game may feel a bit stiff and clunky compared to later evolutions of the genre, but it certainly retains its well-deserved status as an iconic foundational piece of Sega history, and definitely of interest to horror fans for its monstrous creatures and lycanthropic vibes. And that howl is no beast, it's Chakan, the Forever Man, a dark, brooding, and absolutely brutal platforming action title based on a comic book and produced by Ed Annunziata of Ecco the Dolphin fame. You control Chakan, a skilled swordsman that won a wager with Death himself to obtain eternal life, but it ends up cursed with the task of wandering all existence until destroying all supernatural evils in the universe. The game starts in an interdimensional hub area where you can choose from various elemental planes to clear, with a handful of levels and bosses for each, and also housing different weapons required to open up access to new areas. You can also gather various potions which can be combined in different ways for a variety of effects like temporary invulnerability, higher jumps, and of course, the crucial kick-ass flame swords. This game definitely does not hold your hand, and is infamous for its difficulty, further compounded by a constantly ticking hourglass for completing stages, and even a final boss fight in which you have one chance to win and achieve the true ending. Other than that, you do get unlimited lives and continues at least, so with enough determination and patience, clearing Chakan can be a very satisfying achievement. And don't forget to let the credits run for 15 minutes. Despite the challenge, the overall experience is rich with foreboding atmosphere, unsettling music and sound design, and intense air traffic controlling. It's an easy recommendation for those looking to get macabre on the Mega Drive. Now if you thought Chakan was hard, Nightmare Circus would like to have a word. Originally planned for a North American release in 1995, it ultimately was not completely finished, yet it still ran fine enough to finally get a physical release in Brazil the following year, and eventually beamed into the US and UK via the Sega Channel. The game has a legit creepy story about a scumbag circus operator who burns his carnival down to collect the insurance money, and he's fried in the electric chair for the murder of the people inside, but not before vowing to torture the souls of his victims for eternity. Our Native American protagonist, Raven, seeking revenge for his parents, must dig deeper into the mysteries of Nightmare Circus and free the souls captured within. Are the souls being tortured by having to play this game? Maybe. Although, I gotta say, this seems like an example of unrealized potential due to the production being cut so short. I have to imagine actually finishing all of the content and a bit more playtesting and balancing could have done this game a lot of favors, as what we have now is a generally incomprehensible fever dream. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, as there are definitely some creative things going on here, and the more patient and thoughtful players out there might be able to unravel its obtuse secrets. You might also have better success if you can get the hang of a surprisingly vast moveset, or sometimes you even have to use the mode button. Regardless, it's truly an intriguing visit if you're willing to get a little freaky. And with what might likely be the goriest game on this list, we've got Splatterhouse 2, a follow-up to Namco's arcade hit. In Rick's first outing on the Genesis, the gameplay hasn't really changed much from the original, but I'm not complaining. It's a straightforward, slow-moving punch-em-up with a very heavy and weighted feeling to your character, yet it also demands some precision in your combat and avoidance of hazards. The main draw here is certainly the presentation, with Rick's attempt to bring back his girlfriend Jennifer taking him on a blood-soaked adventure full of splattering guts, and you'll be smashing ghouls into chunks right off the bat. There are 8 stages, chock full of horror movie references and inspirations, a handful of brutal weapons to pick up, and some of the most disgusting boss fights of the era. The shock value has probably waned a bit over the years, but keep in mind, this was pretty extreme for the time, before Mortal Kombat really shook things up. All in all, this is truly essential for all the gorehounds out there with eye-popping visuals and a gut-bursting challenge. Now, if you were in the camp of folks disappointed that Splatterhouse 2 was a bit too similar to the first game, maybe Splatterhouse 3 might be more your speed. This time around, Rick finds himself in a belt-action beat-em-up with non-linear exploration of his monster-infested mansion, and your speed of completion also slightly affects the storyline as you go, ultimately leading to 4 different possible endings depending on which of your family members survives the night. More importantly for splatter fans, we have another sloppy gore fest at hand here, as you pummel all these slimy fiends into puddles of fleshy goop, and again we get some great gross out moments during the boss fights. The gameplay is fairly typical of the genre as you wander around and beat up hordes of enemies, but you do get a chance to power up and Hulk out every once in a while, and the previously mentioned time tracking also gives some extra replay value if you wanted to check out all the different cutscenes and endings, which are genuinely pretty creepy and very stylish. Your mileage may vary as to whether you prefer this over the previous entries in the series, but I definitely recommend checking it out either way as one of the best beat-em-ups on the console and a freaky fun time. And while this isn't really a pure horror game, I feel it's worth mentioning if you want to don the hockey mask yet again in Kid Chameleon, an action platformer where you play as a kid too tough to beat, and one who can shapeshift into different characters inside of a virtual reality universe. There are a handful of avatars with unique abilities that you can transform into after collecting the appropriate power-up, like a knight, samurai, or our favorite legally distinct murder beast, maniacs. And since we're in such a varied virtual environment, we get a few rather spooky looking levels and enemies as well. Oh, and let's not forget Juggernaut, the Skull Tank. Again, this only occasionally dips into horror territory, unless you get scared by the fact that there are over 100 levels, branching pathways, and no passwords. And now for one of my personal favorite games for the system, it's Castlevania Bloodlines, the only instance of Konami's flagship vampire hunting franchise on the Genesis. With a bit of different flavor than its 16-bit counterparts on the Super Nintendo and PC Engine, Bloodlines feels a little more in line with more classic Castlevania action that we saw in the NES, but still contains plenty of impressive visuals and design that really push the limits of the hardware, and some especially cool moments of interacting with the ominous environments themselves. It also introduces 2 playable characters, with Belmont descendant John Morris, ready to whip his way to Drac as per usual in a Castlevania title, or you can also try the spear-wielding, super-jumping Eric Lacard, each character providing their own ways to traverse through the game's creative stages, drenched in the gothic atmosphere we've come to expect with the series. It's definitely worth mentioning the wonderful soundtrack as well, with this being Michiru Yamane's first score for a Castlevania game, and she would go on to keep making amazing music for the series to follow. While one could really get worked up trying to decide whether this is better than Castlevania 4 or Rondo of Blood, I'm in the play them all camp, and I actually really appreciate how they each have their own fairly unique vibes and differences. And regardless, Bloodlines is easily a top 5 in the series for me. The Big Drac also shows up on the Genesis in one of many video game adaptations of Bram Stoker's Dracula, cashing in on the hit film by Francis Ford Coppola. In this case, we get a pretty competent action platformer, putting you in control of Jonathan Harker, slashing up all sorts of creepy crawlies in various levels, looking for a specific item in each before moving on to a variety of boss fights, including various forms of Dracula himself. It's a little bit generic looking and feeling, and it has some pretty uninspired level design, but it's generally a pretty fun and spooky time, and at least the Genesis version has an absolutely banging soundtrack from Matt Furness, one aspect I found to be improved over the Super Nintendo version, which is otherwise very similar. Just be prepared for a little bit of Eurojank, with some gotcha traps, lack of invincibility frames, and no enemy knockback. The Frank movie of the era would also get a handful of video games, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein finding its way onto the Genesis and putting you in control of the monster himself, hobbling around with a big stick in the streets of Bavaria, bashing any soldiers and peasants in his path. Now, I've never been to Bavaria, but it's neat that they have invested so much into their moving platform and random wall switch infrastructure. This is definitely an odd one here, but I've honestly been really intrigued to slog further into this game eventually. I'm a sucker for smooth animation at the cost of fluid play controls, but the impatient may give up on old Jankenstein pretty quickly. But I guess if you do go for it, you also might consider the Super Nintendo version for some improved graphics and effects, but either way, the game plays very similarly on both systems. There's also a Sega CD Frankenstein, but it's an entirely different game, and maybe we'll revisit that on a future video exploring the horror games of that library. And yet another horror movie license hitting 16-bit systems was Warlock, released in 1995 and loosely based on Warlock the Armageddon, the second film in the Warlock series, which still starred Julian Sands, rest in peace, but actually had a completely unrelated and unconnected story from the first film. The video game adaptation takes form as a side-scrolling action platformer where you can fire off magic bolts, telekinetically move around a little orb thing to attack enemies and grab items, collect various magic spells, and of course run and jump around in a very smoothly animated and cinematic fashion. The pixel art and overall atmosphere actually feel really well crafted, as you gather rune stones and engage in brief encounters with the Warlock himself as he pops up from time to time. The game is rather challenging, but also quite forgiving in that you can use passwords to keep pushing onwards. I haven't made it too far into this one yet, but I'm definitely determined to dive deeper at some point, and maybe rewatch the movies too. While this one leans more into action and sci-fi elements than pure werewolf horror, Wolfchild is still a pretty rad platformer worth looking at here. Originally released for the Atari ST and Amiga platforms, it was also ported to the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and Sega CD, where you play as Saul Morrow in a mission to rescue your father from the evil Chimera Corporation, who are taking part in all sorts of dastardly experiments. The Amiga vibes are strong here, with wonderful graphics and music, and the love it or hate it sweet stamp of Eurojank. It plays a bit like a run and gun, as long as you maintain enough power to stay in your hybrid wolf form. Otherwise, you'll revert back to a plain old punching dude, and have a much harder time dealing with all the enemies in your path, not unlike the situation we saw in Werewolf on the NES. All three of the home console ports of Wolfchild play pretty similarly to each other. The Sega CD may have the edge in the music department with those hi-fi CD quality jams, but all in all, it's a very solid actioner for anyone looking to howl at the moon for a bit. And here we have one of the most truly terrifying, bone-chilling titles on our list, Magical Hat Turbo Flying Adventure. Oh, wait, I seem to have gotten ahead of myself here. We actually want to look at the mummified version released in 1991, Decap Attack. It's a colorful, goofy, and truly punishing platforming romp where you play as Chuck D. Head on a quest to defeat Max Decap and his underworld army, who are attempting to take over the island with aptly named stages like Abdomen Land and Elbow Island, Tibuland. You get the idea. I guess if you don't like puns, you might not find this game very humorous. Anyways, your mummy-like character, Chuck, has a giant extendable jaw that can pop out of his torso to fend off enemies, along with a detachable skull power-up which you can toss around to take them out from a distance. If you've ever played Psycho Fox or Kid Cool on 8-bit systems, you'll notice that developer Vic Tokai has done this similar gimmick before, but this is probably the most fleshed out version of that game mechanic. There are also tons of different consumable items that you can hoard, and luckily your pal Frankenstein will help explain what all of them do from your inventory menu. No bones about it, Decap Attack is definitely a fun one that never takes itself too seriously and scratches that itch for your silly and spooky Sega needs. Another goofy Genesis horror gem here is EA's Haunting, starring Polterguy, a very unique title putting you in the control of the ghost of a punk kid that was killed in a defective skateboard accident, and seeks revenge on the company's owner and family by scaring the crap out of them. You can possess various household objects and appliances to freak them all out to the point of fleeing the house, eventually forcing them into moving into new homes and further progressing the game. You must also maintain your ectometer the entire time, either with collecting green gloop dropped after scaring family members, or gathering some from the dangerous ecto-beast infested basement if your meter ever runs out entirely. It's a very creative premise, and the highlights are definitely all the silly and crazy animations that you'll see with the wide variety of spooky traps you can set and over 400 objects you can interact with. Maybe it was a few years late, but I always felt like this could have been a fun use for a Beetlejuice license.
It's showtime.
Oh, I said his name twice in a previous video, huh? Is that how that works? Anyways, Haunting is not an incredibly long game, with 4 different houses comprising the stages, but it's no cakewalk either, and it's definitely worth checking out. Coming soon to a Sega Genesis near you is the B-movie-rific Zombies Ate My Neighbors. No one is safe from this top-down shooting terror, overflowing with horror schlock references and spoofs, and tons of wacky weaponry. Developed by LucasArts and published by Konami in 1993, you and a friend can play as Julie or Zeke and save your neighbors from all sorts of creatures and creeps throughout the game's 48 grueling levels. And while the game does have a password system, you may be in trouble when you use one, as it doesn't let you keep any of the many wild and weird items you can gather throughout your playthrough, ranging from explosive soda cans to weed whackers to barrier-busting bazookas. Despite the game's lighthearted comedy horror vibes, it's still a brutally difficult experience that will take some true effort and determination to get through. It was also released on the Super Nintendo, which has a few improvements in graphics and sound, and some other minor differences, but still plays great on the Genesis, which does include a nice on-screen map and radar the entire time. With either port, horror fans will have a blast here.
Ow.
In another great example of a game inspired by B-movie classics, specifically giant bug flicks from the 1950s in this case, we have It Came from the Desert. While this one came out in various adventurous incarnations on the Amiga, PC, and TurboGrafx CD, a more action-focused Genesis version was partially developed and unfortunately never released. The prototype is pretty playable, however. It plays more like a top-down shooter than its point-and-click counterparts. It's certainly unfinished and unpolished, but it's definitely a neat curiosity. And some years ago, there were talks of the dev team Watermelon releasing a finished and cleaned up extended cut of the game, but the project seems to have not materialized. Another prototype that never saw the light is this take on Swamp Thing, developed by Microsmiths. It's also somewhat playable, but undeniably a janky and glitchy mess of a side-scroller, where you play as Swamp Thing himself, punching stuff, turning into logs or other bits of organic matter, and swimming around in hell? It's a shame this one was never finished. While it's a hot mess for sure, there was potential here for a fun, campy classic here. It's worth a look for these sweet dance moves alone. One more unreleased game to mention is Zombie High, developed by EA and cancelled for reasons unknown, and eventually having its unfinished but somewhat playable prototype dumped. Seemingly taking a few cues from Zombies Ate My Neighbors, but with a side-scrolling view, it seems to have some potential with some nice large sprites and edgy teenage attitude. In this state, it's definitely not a finished experience, however, but it's interesting to wonder how this could have graduated into something pretty cool, maybe like a 16-bit ghoul school or something. If you do try this out yourself, you should know that a debug menu and level select is accessible by using a second controller, and is the only way to get past the seemingly invincible enemies at the end of the first hallway in the prototype. And it's time to get slimy with Sega Technical Institute's The Ooze. Released in 1995 in the later years of the Genesis, this is a very unique top-down action game putting you in control of a puddle of ooze hell-bent for revenge on your former employers who injected you with chemicals and flushed you down the toilet, after you uncovered their dastardly scheme to poison the planet while they can sell the only cure. The mechanics are pretty ingenious here, as you can extend your slimy tendrils to attack enemies, while your health is essentially determined by how big your blob is. There's also a heavy emphasis on exploration, as you often must set off various switches to open up access to new areas. Or you can also gather the optional DNA items if you're brave enough to see the game's best ending. The concept is really creative, and the game is oozing with edgy, toxic vibes, but be ready for some extreme difficulty. After much strife, I finally beat the game recently, and I did a full review if you feel like checking that out for a more in-depth look. And if that wasn't enough slime for you, let's take a dip into Todd's Adventures in Slime World, originally an Atari Lynx game, but eventually ported to the PC Engine CD and Sega Genesis. You control intergalactic explorer Todd, and you're not afraid to get a little slimy to collect some big old gems. It plays a little bit like a Metroid game with an emphasis on exploration and collecting various items while blasting away weird creatures with your water cannon. The game has a variety of variations to pick from that not only have different maps, but slight differences in gameplay as well, which may either focus more on puzzle solving, speedrunning, or pure action and survival. I've yet to play the Lynx version, but I have to assume the larger screen is a benefit here. And I also gotta complain about the sound design getting pretty obnoxious at times. The controls are rather clunky as well, but I do like the idea of being able to clean off the sludge from those little water pools scattered throughout, essentially restoring your health. Now I haven't played this one a ton, but I'm thinking it may be worth dipping into it a bit more eventually. Now let's clean up our act and get a little more kid-friendly with the next few games. In this case, with a title based on the Nickelodeon cartoon series, Aaahh! Real Monsters, released for both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. You control the three young monsters Icus, Oblina, and Crumb, teaming together to pass their monster midterm exam, which has tasked them to scare people. It's a somewhat typical platformer, but it does have some interesting mechanics where you can switch between each of the monsters with their own unique abilities, and also requires some teamwork between the three to reach new areas or items. I definitely dig the weird art style of the cartoon, and it seems to have translated over to the game pretty well, so if you're a fan of the show, you may want to give this one a go. In 1995 would see the release of Scooby-Doo Mystery on both the Super Nintendo and Genesis, sharing the same title, but actually being rather different from each other, with the Genesis getting a LucasArts-esque point-and-click adventure title with two different mysteries to solve. You control Shaggy and Scooby wandering around Blake's Hotel or the Ha Ha Carnival, unraveling mysteries as you would likely guess from something starring this iconic Hanna-Barbera cartoon crew. The scum-like interface is a little bit stiff here, and probably could have really benefited from supporting the Mega Mouse, or maybe at least a port to PC or something. But it's still definitely a fun one for adventurous little ones or Scoob enthusiasts of any age.
Jump! Jump! We'll catch you!
And oh no, it's Richard Scarry's Busy Town. Scarry is right there in the title, so it's a horror game. Alright, fine. Moving on. Ah yes, now we have the true horror icon, that is Garfield. Sorry, I couldn't resist showing off this cool lumpy touch clip. Sadly, it isn't a real game, but Garfield caught in the act is. Now, this is not really a horror game per se, but the very first stage is very Halloween, and I thought I'd mention it anyway, as Garfield and Odie make their way through a variety of TV channels with various themes. The cartoon style really translates pretty well here, but getting into this one is way harder than I expected it to be. Now, I won't really take us down into the rabbit hole of games that have one random spooky level in them, but I figured I'd also shout out the wonderful Disney game Quackshot, with a great Transylvania stage full of creepy ghosts and a showdown with a Dracula in duck form. And speaking of Disney, they also produced a Genesis game in 1995 based on their animated series Gargoyles, notable for its much darker and more serious tone compared to most cartoons at the time. The video game version ended up as a very slick and gorgeous looking action platformer, with the same caliber of quality we saw with past Disney Genesis titles like Aladdin or Lion King, along with similar levels of challenge. You control Goliath with a wide array of attacks and flying maneuvers as you seek to put an end to the Eye of Odin, a magical talisman that can corrupt any that obtain it. A Super Nintendo version was also planned but never materialized, but surprisingly enough, a remastered version is on the way with essentially the same gameplay, both options for a more cartoony look, new soundtrack, and of course the ability to play on modern platforms. Either way, it's a great game that I'd certainly recommend if you're up for the challenge. And one more cartoon-based property to showcase here is Toxic Crusaders, a rambunctious beat-em-up based on the cartoon show, which was based on the gore-filled splatter classic Toxic Avenger films from the fine folks at Troma Team, which admittedly plays more like a blood-soaked comic book hero parody than a pure horror film. Now, it's not the first thing you'd expect to be adapted into a kid's show, but here we are. The Genesis game is about as wild and sloppy as you might expect, with some very slippery controls and a general feeling of chaotic inanity. But somehow it's still pretty entertaining for what it is, albeit frustratingly tedious at times. 1991's smash hit film The Addams Family set off a large wave of video game adaptations on tons of different platforms developed by Ocean Software, a developer rather notorious for pumping out heaps of games based on movie licenses. The creepy and kooky fam would of course find their way onto the Genesis with this platformer and versions very similar to this on the Super Nintendo, Amiga, and Atari ST, among others. You play as Gomez, hopping around your family abode in a somewhat non-linear fashion, saving family members, and of course, collecting money. It's kind of generic for the genre, but it actually feels really solid, and honestly, sometimes it's nice to have a more pure platformer to dig into without too many gimmicks and frills. It's well presented too, with a very clean and cartoony look, and feels very faithful to its tongue-in-cheek source material. The film's sequel, Addams Family Values, would also get its own video games on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive, although only European Sega players would be able to get their hands on this version. This time around, we get a top-down action-adventure game, feeling uncannily similar to something like a Zelda title, but with Uncle Fester at the helm of this quest, zapping away through precarious dungeons and various locales on the Addams Family estate, with some mild puzzle-solving elements as well. I gotta say, I hadn't played this one at all before putting this video together, and was honestly really impressed, and definitely want to delve into this one further. The massively successful Ghostbusters franchise would also see its fair share of video games, with the Genesis incarnation released in 1990 actually being one of the better ones, with an action platforming run and gun kind of thing here, letting you play as a big-headed Peter, Ray, or Egon. Sorry Winston, getting the snub again here, but of course ROM hackers would come to the rescue with a cool new version adding him along with other special features and additions. Otherwise, this is a great little game here that captures the spirit of the comedy horror classic film, with 6 different levels, upgradable weaponry, and of course tons of ghostly ghouls to contend with. While it may feel a bit primitive compared to some of the Genesis action games to follow it, it's still definitely a must-play for Ghostbusters fans, and for anyone looking for a silly and supernatural Sega session. It's time for a haunted bootleg with Ghost Hunter, which is basically just the Buster Brothers and Pang clone, released in Taiwan. Honestly, the title is rather misleading, unless these giant bubble faces are supposed to be ghosts. But at least it's hard to go wrong with Pang. A fun little single-screen arcade-style game, and this plays totally fine. Capcom never released a Pang game for the console, so at least we got this one. Don't expect much actual horror, though. Now here we have the Japanese exclusive Mamano Hunter Yoko, based on the manga and anime series you might know as Devil Hunter Yoko. I watched and enjoyed a few of those back when I was a teenager, and is notably the first VHS release by the company AD Vision back in the mid-90s. Recently I was surprised to hear about a related Mega Drive game, and even more pleasantly surprised to report that it's pretty rad, despite a little bit of jank and rather minimalistic looking art style. You control Yoko in a straightforward but very solid action platformer comparable to something like the Valis series, hacking and slashing through all sorts of weird creatures, and also utilizing a protective shield bubble thing which can be launched at enemies as an additional form of offense. The game seems quite difficult and a little bit rough around the edges, but I quickly felt very invested in making more progress after my first attempts, and this is certainly one I'll take another crack at soon. The prolific Makai Mura series is an essential staple in any horror platformer diet, and Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Genesis is certainly a delicious port to dig into, and not to be confused with its somewhat different and also extremely good counterpart on the Super Nintendo. Originally released in arcades by Capcom in 1988, they really knocked it out of the park with this impressive conversion the following year, and provided yet another strong case for the Genesis being capable of bringing authentic arcade experiences into your living room. You control Sir Arthur once again in a battle against Lucifer, and to save the souls of old Prin Prin and your fellow villagers. The core gameplay of the original Ghosts and Goblins is still here, but with more weapons, fancy gold armor, and the ability to fire upwards. No double jumping here, you'll have to switch over to the Super Nintendo game for that. The environments have also been ramped up a notch as you make your way through some truly epic levels and boss fights, twice of course, with that required second loop once again to get the real final boss battle and ending. The challenge you know and love, or hate, is definitely still here as well, but I'd say this is one of the more reasonable games in the series, especially considering its generous checkpoints and unlimited continues. It's an absolute classic and comes highly recommended here, regardless of the season. In what might first be disregarded as an Amiga-originated Ghouls and Ghosts clone, Risky Woods by EA proves to be a bit of a different beast in some ways. You play as Rohan on a quest to rescue monks who have been frozen into statues by the evil Draxos, armed with throwing knives to start, but eventually being able to grab other weapons like axes, boomerangs, and fireballs. What gets a bit weird are how some of the item drops are more hazardous than the enemies, such as items that transport you back several screens while your often tight time limit per stage keeps you rushing along. And in a few extra trolley additions in this Genesis port, some of the monks you save just attack you once you free them. Not to mention you have to do these weird Simon Says memorization sequences to unlock new areas. Despite some of these slightly bewildering design choices, it's still oddly intriguing and definitely an interesting challenge to take on, and certainly some nice visuals fairly typical of an Amiga title ported over to the Genesis. While we're talking Amiga, we've got to get into Shadow of the Beast, originally released in 1989 and eventually ported to many other platforms and consoles including the Sega Genesis. And the original was well received at the time for its impressive graphics, trippy parallax scenery, and having a fairly expansive open world design within its side-scrolling action framework. And some things you should know about the Genesis port, however, the US version was not optimized correctly and actually runs faster than intended, making an already brutally difficult game even more insane. So you might want to check out the Japanese Mega Drive version for something more approachable, which fixed the speed issue, added an ending sequence, and even an extra healing item near the end of the game. Shadow of the Beast would get this sequel as well, again first releasing on the Amiga and eventually finding its way onto the Sega Genesis and Sega CD. With a similar feel to the first game, but containing even more non-linearity, for better or worse depending on how much random exploration you like to take part in. Honestly, I haven't played this one very much, but from what I've read, the Sega CD version seems to be a more ideal way to play the game on home consoles, with more content, more weapons, more balanced difficulty, more characters, and of course some tasty FMV cutscenes. Wardner was originally released in arcades by Taito in 1987, and developed by Toplan, who would go on to be regarded as one of the best shmup development teams of their time. But in this case, they created a difficult action platformer in a very similar vein to the Ghosts and Goblins series, albeit with a much cuter looking character design. Cartman, is that you? It would also get a port for the Famicom Disk System in 1989, and finally came to the Genesis in 1991. While it feels a little unfair to stack this one up against something like the much more contemporary Ghouls and Ghosts, Wardner is still a lot of arcadey fun, and also branches out from pure platforming a bit, with some levels being a bit more maze-like. The Genesis port also saw quite a few changes from its original arcade version, with some different bosses, expanded stages, and some slight changes to obstacles and bonus items. 1991 would also see another older game ported to the Genesis with the infamous Dark Castle, originally released for the Macintosh in 1986. Originally in black and white and possibly one of the first games to ever combine WASD for movement and mouse clicking to aim and shoot, it was a pretty impressive game for its time with detailed graphics, digitized sound, and smooth animations. Now 5 years later, it's So the gameplay is pretty faithful to the original, but it certainly feels pretty dated. Not to mention much harder to control since you're using a controller to change the trajectory of your only means of attack, throwing rocks. It was already pretty tough thanks to how weak your character is, prone to dizziness and often left vulnerable to enemies. And the sound effects feel real goofy now, and it can get a bit aggravating while you struggle through such a difficult game. I'm not saying you can't have fun with this one regardless, but just know ahead of time that this is probably one of the jankiest games on the system. Electronic Arts would also bring over this isometric dungeon crawler in 1991, Will Harvey's The Immortal, a brutally challenging action RPG that was originally made for the Apple IIgs and ported to several other platforms as well. Somewhat infamous for its cryptic nature and trial and error gameplay, the Genesis version also features some great gruesome gore that NES players certainly missed out on. It's not just the goblins in danger here, you're constantly one step away from all sorts of horrifying forms of demise, even if you decide to get experimental with some of the items you find. It's a gorgeous yet terrifying experience, and certainly not for the faint of heart or the impatient. You might want to consider a walkthrough to help on this one if you're not a masochist. And this is Mystic Defender, a very early Sega title first released on the Japanese Mega Drive in 1989 and in other regions the following year. It's considered an indirect sequel to Spellcaster on the Master System, mostly due to being based on the same source material, Kujaku-O, an anime, manga, and live-action film series also known as Peacock King. I can vouch for the movies, directed by the same guy that made the story of Riki-O, and they're great fun if you ever get a chance to see them. In the game, you play as Joe Yamato, a powerful sorcerer out to stop the evil Zareth and his demonic minions from resurrecting an ancient god. It plays a bit like a run and gun, but offers some further variety in your attacks as you progress and learn new spells to switch between at will. It's also chock full of creepy settings, goopy monsters, and even some weird Giger-esque bio-horror locales, and is definitely an action-packed blast to play through. Now we're starting to veer away from pure horror and more into the dark fantasy territory kind of stuff now, but I definitely gotta bring up this wild Japanese Mega Drive exclusive, Dana Megami Tanjo. You know you're in for a treat when the game starts off with you riding a freaking ogre. You control Dana in this violent hack-and-slash actioner full of monsters and magic. Now I'm pretty new to this game, but the first few levels I tried out are super intense and loaded with style. It's a challenging one as well that I will surely revisit sometime soon. It's probably comparable to something like Rastan, which might be no surprise considering it shares some of the same development team. Now I could go on for quite some time covering a wide array of darker fantasy gems on the system, many that aren't quite what I would call horror games in the pure sense, if there really is such a thing, but could be of interest if you're into slicing through weird monsters with big axes and lightning bolts. So let's list off a handful here to at least get you started. Now those looking to get their barbaric broadsword on will surely want to check out titles like Jewel Master, Blades of Vengeance, Alicia Dragoon, Rastan Saga 2, Kadash, Shadow Blasters, Gauntlet 4, Light Crusader, Beyond Oasis, Saint Sword, Stormlord, Sword of Sodan, and of course, the iconic Golden Axe series. Other curiosities include the roguelike Fatal Labyrinth, an unreleased prototype of Dragon's Lair similar to the Super Nintendo version, the yokai-infested beat-em-up Mystical Fighter, and I also gotta shout out the Castlevania-like Valis games, and we might as well toss in El Viento and Ernest Evans into the mix. And I'd be remiss not to mention the wonderful Phantasy Star series of RPGs as well, with occasional moments of heavy cosmic bio-horror vibes. Really, the Genesis was home to tons of great fantasy games, and I could probably keep rattling off more titles in this field for quite a while. Let's save that for another time, and move on to some of the other unique horror genre hybrids. Alright, it's time for some demonic pinball with Dragon's Fury. Released for the Genesis in 1992, this is Technosoft's port of Devil's Crush, which was originally released for the TurboGrafx in 1990. The second title from the Crush Pinball series features a 3-tiered playfield with a demonic medieval setting with a steady flow of skeletons, cultists, and other creepy creatures to contend with. The series is also well known for its bonus rooms, often featuring little mini-boss fights and wonderful monster designs. Besides horror stuff, I'm also a big pinball fan, and I could safely call this my favorite video pinball game on any system, and it plays great regardless if you play it on the Genesis or in its original TurboGrafx incarnation. The presentation, the music, and the gameplay are all top-notch for the genre, and it comes highly recommended here. You may be inclined to check out the Japanese Mega Drive version Devil Crash as well, for a little bit less censorship of some of the demonic imagery. It's worth noting that this also got a kinda weird spin-off sequel on the Genesis from Tengen called Dragon's Revenge, which is definitely leaning more towards fantasy and less into horror, and it's certainly more jank, but worth a look anyways. And we'll keep that spooky ball in play here with Devilish: The Next Possession, released in 1992 and a sequel to the original Devilish released on Game Gear. Here we have some similar demonic dark fantasy vibes to Dragon's Fury, but with more of a breakout Arkanoid inspiration for its gameplay, with scrolling levels as you advance your ball and paddles through various sorts of blocks and various enemies, and ultimately a boss battle or other challenge for each stage. You can change your paddle formation around a bit to take better control of your situation, and pick up a variety of different power-ups as well. There's even a 2-player option that allows for each person to control each paddle independently, which gets a bit chaotic, but definitely a fun time. Speaking of time, a lot of the challenge here is due to some pretty tight time limits per stage, so you don't want to waste any of it. And there's also a time trial mode if you want to take a crack at speedrunning the 7 different stages. And with possibly the strangest genre combo in this video, it might have to be smashing together horror and sports with Mutant League Football. Released in 1993 by EA and working off of the Madden 93 game engine, they've taken a typical football game formula and injected it with all sorts of twisted dark humor. You've got crazy post-apocalyptic stadiums to play on, full of crazy hazards, teams full of skeletons, orcs, robots, aliens, and plenty of great trash talking from the players and coaches. You can also get nasty with plays and audibles that can grant your players temporary abilities, or maybe just bribe the ref to call ridiculous penalties against your opponents, which won't stop until they straight up murder him and bring in a replacement. All in all, this game is hilarious, and actually plays pretty well since they had a solid engine to work with. The following year would also see a release of Mutant League Hockey, very similar in tone with plenty of hilarious ways to maim your opponents. This one feels a little less fleshed out from the football game, but it's still tons of fun, and at least lets a brutal fist fight break out from time to time. Now here we have Beast Wrestler, a monster wrestling game released in 1991 and developed by Telenet. The core gameplay is pretty typical for the genre, and admittedly a bit janky, but the big draw here is selecting from a wide range of grotesque creatures genetically engineered for our enjoyment. Beyond a straight up 1 versus 1 match, the game also features a pretty expansive 1-player tournament mode, where you can level up your beast by purchasing things like whips and food to increase your stats while training, and eventually fuse with other monsters to further customize your creature as you advance through the ranks. On top of your typical wrestling moves, you also have special death blow techniques critical to dealing enough damage in order to KO your opponent and claim victory. While your first instinct may be to button mash in this one, upon further research you may find more deliberate observation and timing will lead to success in your rise to supremacy against the other Dragon Warrior competitors. Some horror vibes also find their way into Undead Line, a top-down auto-scrolling shoot-'em-up originally released on the MSX and having a reputation for being notoriously difficult. The Japanese exclusive Mega Drive version doesn't pull any punches either, in 6 stages with 0 checkpoints, and of course you lose all of your power-ups when you die. Even just picking up the power-up you want is kinda tricky, as the treasure chests change the item with every shot, and the wrong upgrade will start you from scratch with that particular weapon. It's an intense and frantically fun experience with tons of cool monsters and giant bosses to face off with, and even some leveling up of your stats if you can manage to collect the fast-moving fairies in each stage. You do have some different difficulty settings as well, and the hardest modes get truly crazy. Now the Genesis and Mega Drive had so many great shmups, and several of them have lots of really cool freaky monsters and stuff in them, but it might get a bit off topic to really dig into all of them, so I'll just mention a few. Similar to Undead Line, we've got 2 excellent top-down on-foot shooters, Elemental Master and Twinkle Tail, and the auto-scrolling shmups Eliminate Down, Dangerous Seed, Biohazard Battle, and Wings of War. That's really barely scraping the surface of great shmups on the system, but I thought those might be of special interest for some occasional horror aesthetics and grotesque moments. And it's time for some carnage with the edgy isometric run-and-gunner Skeleton Crew, developed by Core Design and released in 1995, fairly late in the life cycle of the Genesis. You control one of 3 different mercenaries tasked with taking down Lord Cadaver, who has unleashed his army of psychogenics mutants upon Monstro City. Since the Genesis can't easily support twin-stick shooting controls, you'll instead be using buttons to rotate your torso while firing away, which certainly takes some getting used to. You have unlimited bullets and grenades, but not much else, as you make your way through a handful of stages drenched with cyber grimdark atmosphere, and the stylish pixel art really shines here. There's a good variety of monsters and cool bosses to face off with as well, including a very memorable final boss that you even have the choice of executing or not. 2-player co-op and different difficulty modes round out the features here, and while the gameplay isn't anything too innovative, it's definitely a fun one to blast through in an afternoon or two. And he's in town with a few days to kill. It's Predator 2. Everyone's favorite big game hunter would hit the Genesis in this game loosely based on the film sequel, and also released on the Master System and Game Gear. It's 1997 in Los Angeles, and you control Lieutenant Harrigan in this hectic top-down shooter feeling like some sort of narc Smash TV mashup, gunning down drug dealers, collecting their paraphernalia, and rescuing hostages before the Predator's laser sights get to them. I thought Predators liked hunting for sport, but whatever. You'll run and gun your way through various locales before eventually reaching the alien ship itself, and you can arm yourself with a nice variety of both Earthling and alien weapons. Although generally feeling a bit unhinged in terms of its game design, this is definitely a fun one if you're into the genre, and certainly a step up from the NES Predator game we got a few years prior, or the somewhat generic Predator 2 on-rails shooter games released on computer platforms. Another big-budget sci-fi horror sequel would hatch all sorts of video game adaptations with Alien 3, but the Genesis received the honor of getting the first Alien 3 game released in October of 1992. You play as Ripley in a side-scrolling action platformer blasting away xenomorphs while rescuing a required number of prisoners from their chest-bursting fate before the level's timer expires. This creates a lot of tension as you race through the maze-like levels dripping with acid-soaked dread and a dark, gritty ambiance. Now don't expect the slow burn of the film. This one mostly ignores the movie's plot and it's pretty action-packed comparably. And definitely a solid action game if you don't mind some trial and error, learning the stage layouts and locations of prisoners, and other helpful item pickups. Be warned, there are no passwords or continues in this one, but you at least get some difficulty options to change the number of lives you start with, along with how much time and ammo you start with per stage. As far as which port to play, this one feels like one of the definitive choices to me, but you might also want to check out the slight Metroid-like differences in the Super Nintendo version, or maybe the drastic differences in the Game Boy port, which evolved into a top-down shooter. And the Alien film franchise would also heavily inspire this essential beat-em-up title, Alien Storm, originally released in arcades in 1990 and ported to the Genesis with a quite faithful home conversion in 1991. It's basically Golden Axe, but with aliens, and I'm totally on board with this. You'll choose from 3 different characters and brawl your way through hordes of extraterrestrial goons, with a few bits of mega destructive on-rail shooting moments and these crazy sprinting sections that almost play like a horizontal shmup. These gameplay variations really spice things up along the way, a much appreciated change of pace in a genre that can get somewhat repetitive sometimes. There's a bit of energy management as well, as you'll need to keep collecting battery cells to have full effectiveness of your attacks, or to pull off the screen-clearing special moves when things get too dicey. And overall, this is just plain fun, and injects plenty of B-movie flavored humor as well, and it's a must-play for sci-fi horror fiends. On the other side of the intensity spectrum here, we have Psy-O-Blade, a slow burn point-and-click adventure that was only released in Japan, originally on computer platforms in 1988, and eventually ported to the Mega Drive in 1990. Luckily, a few years back, efforts were made to make a fully playable and well-crafted English translation, which you're seeing here. Now, I haven't played through this one all the way, but right off the bat, I'm seeing some heavy alien-inspired vibes here. In fact, even the game's characters notice this. You will need some patience, as it utilizes the typical visual novel gameplay sensibilities, where you're often relegated to just clicking on random things in a room until you set off a trigger that allows for progress or other dialogue options. And for better or worse, it doesn't seem like you can randomly die from your decisions like Shadowgate, which gives it a bit more focus on narrative instead of puzzle solving. It's probably worth a look if you can get into the story, or if you're a fan of the genre, as this is one of the few examples of it on the hardware. Eric Chahi's cinematic platforming masterpiece, Another World, would also find its way onto the Genesis, released as Out of This World in North America. Originally released on Amiga in 1991, it would gradually get ported to other systems in the years to follow, and is highly regarded and rather influential for its cinematic feel and distinct art style. It's a little bit of a stretch to call it a horror game exactly, but you'd be hard-pressed to find other games of this era to present such tense and alien atmospheres so effectively, with fear being further compounded by being constantly one step away from a grisly demise. Luckily, you have unlimited lives, but if you know what you're doing, the game is rather short. Regardless, I consider this to be an incredible piece of work and a great example of games as an art form. However, I can't fully recommend the Genesis version. It's certainly playable, but I'd probably suggest the more recent remastered versions at this point for a better and more complete experience. It's also worth mentioning that this also got bundled on the Sega CD with a sequel exclusive to the add-on with Heart of the Alien, but that was developed without Chahi's direct involvement and was basically disowned by him after its release. The Genesis was also home to so many other great sci-fi action and run-and-gun games that I can't quite pin down as horror, but certainly worth mentioning for either great monster design, excessive gore, or just creepy bio-horror sci-fi vibes in general. We've got essential run-and-guns like Contra Hardcore, Mega Turk, and Alien Soldier, and Doom Troopers must be honorably mentioned here for this puking skeleton boss alone. And a few first-person oddities here as well, with the Doom-like games Bloodshot and Zero Tolerance, the one-on-one arena monster battler Death Duel, and the sci-fi action light gun games T2 the arcade game and Body Count, which also happened to get repackaged as a Resident Evil bootleg in Russia. And there were also 2 other Terminator games for each movie, along with the blood-soaked RoboCop vs. Terminator. And while we're skimming through relevant genres, I wanted to give a quick list of some hyper-violent fighting games, a burgeoning genre at the time thanks to the wild success of Mortal Kombat. Now again, I wouldn't quite call these horror games, but some of the characters and settings certainly have some influence from horror pop culture, or at the very least, gorehounds out there will want to take a crack at maiming and mangling their opponents. Aside from the previously mentioned Mortal Kombat series, we also have Eternal Champions, Weapon Lord, Time Killers, Primal Rage, and Slaughter Sport. And for any kaiju fans out there, we can't forget the two King of the Monsters games, Fighting Masters, and my boy Ultraman. Oh man, is that everything? Oh wait, yes, homebrew games. Luckily, many talented developers out there are still making games for this wonderful console, including quite a few great horror-themed titles. Now I'll probably be giving those more love in their own separate videos someday. And the same goes for Sega CD and 32X games. There are some great ones for those console add-ons that will definitely get some later coverage here as well. Okay, now I think that's it. Wait, what? Did you hear that? Oh, right. Yeah, this game is as terrifying as it gets. Don't be fooled by the cute dolphin on the cover and title screen. Ecco the Dolphin is a truly terrifying submersion into a hellish underwater nightmare, a constant tense struggle to survive while nothing around you makes any sense. Don't get me wrong, I actually really enjoy this game, but man, the end of this is legit scary. Thanks so much for watching, folks. I'm gonna go lie down in a fetal position and try not to let the Vortex Queen eat me. Now imagine I might have left out a few potential games from this video, so please be sure to let me know in the comments if you have any other Genesis horror game suggestions, as I'd love to hear about them. And if you like this format, I also made a similar video covering the NES and Famicom, if you'd like to check that out as well. I'll see you next time.
Stay strong.